Good morning, everyone. There we go. So I'm going to talk about the open source and openness and inclusiveness about Kubernetes. Tell me who knows about Kubernetes. Who runs Kubernetes? A few of you. Who of you are investigating Kubernetes? Okay, who of you know nothing yet about Kubernetes? Excellent. I will touch on topics that will interest all of you, I hope. But those of you who said you know nothing about Kubernetes, you now know Redis Enterprise runs on Kubernetes. So we know something already. It's an important starting point. So in order to tell this story, I have to go back in time. So we're going to go back a little bit here. And I went too far back. This was one of the last talks I gave, actually, on databases and data stores in 2012, back when everything was still on hardware that we all managed. Really weird. Anyway, too far back. So let's go, well, before we go forward, I'll let you in on a little secret. So I ran a database orchestration and database as a service company for about 10 years. And this was during the evolution from everything being relational databases to the proliferation of non-relational databases. And then now, since, we've watched sort of the consolidation down to several specific winners fitting specific use cases. And Redis is, of course, one of those, which is awesome. But that's not the secret. The secret here is that data work and data stores is still my favorite tech work. Don't tell anybody, though, because I work on Kubernetes and open source broadly now. So we'll go forward in time. All right, so to tell the Kubernetes story, we actually have to go to 2015. So 2015 was the 1.0 release of Kubernetes at OSCON that year. And that story began a year before that and was 4 engineers inside Google saying, what we really want to do is take Google's secret sauce and share it as open source to the world. Well, this, as you might imagine, was actually a really hard sell. So we had these industry-changing visions. The vision was change the way the cloud industry talked about portable workload units. Maybe it was a VM, maybe it was a jar file. We had different ways of talking about things, but really our workload and applications weren't that portable at the time. And Google has this huge history of running containers. We've been running containers for more than 10 years at this point. And in 2015, remember this is 2015, we ran more than 2 billion containers a week. Today, we run more than 4 billion containers a week. We launch them, we kill them, we move on. But this is 2015 again, 2 billion containers a week. Google has this grand vision. We can help you. We understand containers. We've been doing this a long time. We did a lot of the foundational work around C groups and the upstream changes to Linux because we really want to be a good partner in open source ecosystems. We want to change computers, or change conversations about cloud computing. And we need to do this, in order to really do this, we need to do a cross-industry collaboration. Okay, that's great. We have this big, big vision. The cross-industry collaboration is really what will take containers to ubiquity. Docker was just coming up, making things much more usable. And we still needed a way to get past, I have a few containers on my laptop, to how in the world do I rationalize all these containers out when I'm operating a full system? So here we come out, 2015, Kubernetes by Google. How many people think that that looks like a cross-industry collaboration? Same number of people with AOL addresses. Huh, who knew? We really should stop making fun of AOL. So I was brought in to Google to take Kubernetes from a company-led project to a community-led project and make a whole bunch of changes in the way the open source was governed and managed and engaged with the community in order to make sure that we took this out and really changed the industry. I have to say, I'm thrilled to say, we've actually done this very well. There are more than 4,000 projects now that are based on Kubernetes. We have had more than 15,000 people make contribution to the different projects that are associated with Kubernetes, as well as the Kubernetes project, and of course the vanity metric of Kubernetes, or GitHub stars for Kubernetes. But since some of you said you don't know anything about Kubernetes, let me give you the 10,000-foot view. So Users, people actually use and interact with Kubernetes. They interact through APIs, CLIs, and UIs, different ways. Then there's a set of services that are Kubernetes itself, which actually control all of your nodes, your pods, your clusters, and all of the different components that make for that self-healing, self-managed container orchestration system. And that is kubelet managing all of the different containers on top of your nodes. But that really looks like people use an API to manage container clusters. Really straightforward. But why do we care about this? Why does it matter? When people talk about infrastructure, they talk about infrastructure in a way that the tech is super cool, which it is to a lot of people. But ultimately, what we can do with it is the important part. So workload portability was the whole idea behind this grand industry-changing vision and how to change cloud computing. We wanted to make sure, because we listened to our users who said that they don't want to be either locked in or locked out of a particular system. So we wanted to make sure that our end users and our application developers could make applications that were built on top of containers, built into containers, and then they could be deployed wherever you wanted. You could deploy on your own hardware, you could deploy in a cloud, you could deploy on a private cloud, you could deploy on your laptop. Workload portability is the actual vision that we've tried to do in the industry for so many years, Java included. What is write once and run anywhere? How can we keep application developers from having to know anything specific about their environment or their infrastructure? And lastly, we want to make sure they do not couple to that infrastructure. Make sure that no one needs, as an application developer, to understand what infrastructure software is running and what hardware is running. That all gets you portability. Your apps get built once, you can build them, deploy them on your laptop, you can then run them on your hardware under your desk, if anybody still has hardware under their desk. You can run them in your data centers, again, if anybody still has data centers, out in a cloud, whichever cloud. The gaming industry is a great example of really needing low latency access to different hardware and different cloud availability zones, which actually leads to a multi-cloud or a hybrid scenario in a lot of cases. And we really hope that Kubernetes allows you to have that workload portability. Lots and lots of people use it for these type of operations. So NASCAR slides are great, but let's talk about a specific case. Who here works in operations? Anybody? Operations, all right. So I'm gonna show some graphs, and I wanna know if you've ever seen graphs like this. So this is a graph. That orange line is the end user going, no, this is as big as it could possibly be. The red line is what ops plans for, because operations always plans for way more just in case, because you're trusted with keeping services up and running. And then the green line in this case is what actually happened. Anybody have a guess as to what this was? Pokemon Go. Somebody's heard my talk before or seen this. We use this slide a lot. So Niantic actually gave us the orange line numbers. Google Kubernetes engine engineers gave the red line, and then the green line was what we had to actually accommodate. And because of that, we actually gave Pikachu to everyone. The Pokemon Go and Niantic were super good stress tests and stress cases for the story that we say of both workload portability and elasticity and all of this. But it's not just games. I like talking about games because it's fun, but it's not just games, but it's also web scale companies, enterprise companies. You saw that NASCAR slide, lots of people making use of Kubernetes. And what we find underpins this, to Scott's point earlier this morning, is community. And that community, we had to make sure really grounded what and how Kubernetes was built and what and how we interacted with our users, our contributors, and more broadly, the world. This is a picture from the KubeCon that just happened in December. I guess not just happened, there's one happening next week in Copenhagen. This is more than 4,000 people at KubeCon. So we spent KubeCon really thinking about what was important and working through with the community the values that we want to see growing in that culture. So we're building a distributed compute platform, so we should really think about distribution as a value. And if we look back to Conway's law, that software reflects your organizational structure and your organizational structure reflects your software, we wanted to make sure within the Kubernetes community that not only were we building a distributed compute platform, we were building a distributed governance system for that open source project. So one of our values is distribution is greater than centralization. We look at this in terms of multiple nodes and multiple ways that your application can work within Kubernetes, and then multiple nodes and multiple groups that can make decisions within the Kubernetes project. So in this image, you can think of these nodes as either compute or actual decision makers within the project. We also spent a lot of time thinking about the fact that no one use case is correct. No one workload is correct. And we wanted to be able to offer for our end users a very inclusive experience. So your workload ran just as well as someone else's workload. So broadly speaking, this inclusivity versus exclusivity, which we favor inclusivity, is looked at from a perspective both of people and of the technology again. So we want to make sure that we hear many voices, many different types of voices with many different levels of experience, telling us their problems, their use cases, their experiences, and making sure that that work gets folded back into the project. Another value that we found bubbling up in Kubernetes was community being more important than company. So some of the strange and difficult experiences in some of the other large-scale open source projects have come when a particular company is the focus of either that project or a particular feature set. And we wanted to draw together this group of people that think about Kubernetes as a whole and the success of Kubernetes over the success of their single company. The single companies will grow with Kubernetes and will benefit from Kubernetes, but they are not the first thought. The first thought is how to get Kubernetes to be successful. Now that said, it also forms some really interesting side pieces, because if we're focusing on the community from a people perspective, we end up with things like yoga at Kubernetes events, because there are enough people that want to get together and share their different interests, which may not directly go into the technology, but are certainly an important piece of this. And some of these different cultural components bubble up in terms of different imagery also that ends up in some of our community documentation, like a Kubernetes is self-healing yogi. We also focus on automation over process. When you have a super high scale open source community, you break GitHub in a lot of different ways. So we've written and open sourced, of course, a bunch of tooling that makes sure that we are able to automate things like merges and automate away a lot of the permission pain that has happened inside GitHub. So we focus on automation first over process. But very importantly, where we can't automate things, we reward work that is low glamour. This is the work that we refer to as chopping wood and carrying water. There is project work, there will always be project work that can't be automated, that isn't very exciting, that just needs to happen. And in order to make sure that that work happens, we actually spent a lot of effort rewarding companies for their contributions that are strictly for the project, whereas we reward individuals for work that they do that might support their company. that makes some sense. So you wouldn't say company X made feature X. You would say company X helped us with documentation writers, because that's the important part. That's the support of the project, as opposed to supporting the needs of the company or the vendor themselves. Chopping wood and carrying water is a big cultural value. Another one we have is improvement is always better than stagnation. We spend a lot of time making sure that the Kubernetes culture is in fact a growing and learning culture. After every release, we do a retrospective. This isn't uncommon in software development, but it is an interesting thing to do when you have so many contributors from so many different companies with so many different goals. The first couple of minutes of each of our retrospectives is also looking back at the goals and accomplishments from the prior retrospective, because each retrospective gives us ideas of process change and in different tools we need to make and we need in order to make the project go faster. We also spend a lot of time working across other open source communities, making sure that we're learning from what they have done and always making new mistakes. But coming together, of course, is just the start. Figuring out how we work together is the next step, but actually making this go is the most important part of this and the success that we're going to have. So that brings us to Google's concept behind this. And why did Google do this? Google did this because it is a business benefit. There is economic value for Google to make workloads portable, and then earn your business based on our capabilities and our commitment to openness. Scott talked about no clear leader right now in open source. We're trying to help and be a clear leader in open source, and that includes making sure that Google Cloud Platform is one of the best places to run open source projects, both as an end user and in partnership and collaboration with companies that run or that build open source software. Which leads to my big announcement. Yesterday, we announced the cloud memory store for Redis, which is going into beta, and it's a fully managed in-memory data store that allows you to run Redis without any changes to your, managed Redis without any changes to your application if you need to. We also help you determine if you are able to use the memory store Redis or if you actually need Redis Enterprise. This, though, is key to us all focusing on open source, making sure open source is sustainable, and continuing, as we heard earlier in these conversations this morning, to make sure that open source is viable, that open source ecosystems actually allow people to be paid and grow companies, and making sure that there are clear boundaries as to where large cloud companies develop and where they allow the ecosystem to flourish. So help us shape open source, help us shape our industry, and help Google live up to our aspiration to be the fastest growing and most open community. Thank you.